Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 45 Minutes On webinar this evening, certainly in Australia and whatever time you are in your part of the world. It's a pleasure to have with us this evening Pippa Howard, who is an ASI Board Director and also the Chief Nature Strategist for Nature Metrics, and Sasha Courville, who's the Chair of the ASI Board, and in her day job is the Chief Impact Officer at Bank Australia. And we're going to be talking about the nature positive element, new nature positive frameworks that are coming through, what they mean for business, for governments, and of course for ASI as an initiative. And nature positive being one of our 4 sustainability priorities. So they are climate, circularity, nature positive, and human rights. And I'm sure Pippa will touch on the fact that these are actually quite interconnected issues. So on that note, Pippa, I'm going to hand over to you to take us through your thoughts, and Sasha will also bring in some of her perspectives as well. Thanks, Pippa.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fiona, and welcome to everybody on the call. I'm sitting in Cambridge at the moment. It's kind of nearly midday, so thanks for joining. Fiona, this is an incredibly important topic and it's really exciting. It's great to have Sasha as part of this presentation, such a knowledge. So I'm going to bring you in, Sasha, on certain parts of this. So I look forward to your thoughts too. But there's been a huge shift really around the kind of agenda and where biodiversity and nature sit within the whole ESG framework really. And understanding your nature impact is as vital as understanding your climate impact. And as members of ASI and our duty really as the board of ASI is really to bring these issues really to the fore so that we are well equipped to deal with what's coming at us and actually to understand where, what the business case is, but also how this sort of fits within the overall framework of our standards, the principles, and what we're trying to do as individual companies in delivering responsible practices. So nature used to be a curiosity. If we go cast back a kind of not even just decades, but actually over the last century or so, and it's always been a sort of incredibly important resource, part of our economies. But over the last decade or so, we've started to see it coming up as risk, and this whole idea of nature-related risk is sort of coming onto the agenda with a whole lot of acronyms and alphabet soup that we'll look at in a minute, things like TNFD and the Science-Based Targets for Nature, SBTN, and all of that. But actually what this is doing is kind of feeding nature into a highly regulated space too. So we need to be aware of where this is coming from, what it means to our companies, but also, how the policy agenda and the regulatory frameworks around the world are starting to drive a lot of change too. Now, the World Economic Forum has told us that there is $44 trillion of economic value is generated across the world, and that is entirely dependent on nature. So it makes nature essentially a much bigger part of our consciousness and part of our decision making. And there's a hugely important business case around why we need to mainstream biodiversity and nature in our decision making, but also in the way that we respond both up and down the value chain. And the language around this has changed a lot over the last couple of years too. So this idea of nature-related risk, as I've mentioned, but also just the kind of drivers that are part of why we need to understand that business case for different parts of the value chain, but different parts of the economy too. So some of those drivers are internal around, nature-related risk in our operational context, and this may be climate-related, nature-related risk, where we have uncertainties around things like, how we deal with floods and a changing climate, and how we adapt and build resilience in our operations, but also around some of the supply chains, as I mentioned. And of course, this is now forcing through in line with what's coming through from the finance sector too. And Sasha, I'd love you to contribute on this in particular. But there's been an evolution, really. I think, some of us are familiar with the Equator Principles, which started out with the IFC, the International Finance Corporation's performance standards, and the sort of environmental and social safeguards that were put in place around looking after biodiversity as a resource and as natural capital, but really also this idea that there is a whole voluntary component to the type of commitments that companies have made over the last decade or so. So we've seen an increasing emergence of frameworks that talk to nature positive, net positive impact, no net loss, net gain, these sorts of things, which are really around identifying biodiversity values in a landscape or where our operations are, and then responding to them in the most responsible way. I'm going to talk a little bit around some of these things. We've got this concept really about nature positive, which is derived from a number of different points. Part of that, as I say, is coming from the environmental and social safeguards, but the rest of the world is sort of caught up and it's come through very strongly in the global biodiversity framework, which I'll get to in a minute. But this whole idea of, why we should be doing something positive for nature has come from increasing evidence of really the problems we have. And, this has caused companies to make these sorts of commitments. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, has written some papers on this. It talks to the mitigation hierarchy and things that we're familiar with and are built within our safeguards and within the standards of ASI. But how we respond to this is really important, and we need to equip ourselves essentially both to monitor and measure, but also to adapt and put in action plans that are applying the best possible practices and principles to make sure that we're contributing to the sort of global objectives that have been set. So there's a lot of evidence that's come through about, breaching planetary boundaries, about the loss of biodiversity. And if we think about some of the kind of quite scary evidence that comes through from reports like the WWF Living Planet report, where we've see almost 70% of loss of wildlife since the 1970s, is really resulted over this massive increase in industrialization, in agricultural loss of habitat, driven loss of habitat. You can see sort of meat production, all of these things are contributing to rather depressing sort of metrics and indicators that are talking about the decline of biodiversity. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has given similar evidence and reports, and they're working very hard to try and, rally not only the evidence base that will help us, like we did with climate, to kind of hop on and start doing something about this as individuals and as companies, but as entire sectors too. So the other really strong sort of evidence that has led to driving this business case and this realization, I mentioned the 44 trillion from the World Economic Forum, but one of the kind of go-to reports that I reference every year is the World Economic Forum's risk report. And you can see that over the last decade or two, decade and a half, biodiversity has gone from a sort of low likelihood, low impact, not very sort of important part of our kind of consciousness, right up into the top right-hand corner, where we're now sitting with biodiversity as a major economic risk, both in the shorter and the long term. Important because actually biodiversity and nature is really integrated into how we manage social risk. We look at everything from climate risk to food security, health, all of these things are integrated. So when you look at environmental and social governance aspects, nature is embedded within all of these. And I think that's been a huge transformation over the last few years. In particular is how, as you can see from this part of the kind of image on the left, that nature and environment are utterly integrated into so many different aspects of sustainability performance. So last year, the business and finance really woke up to the need to monitor our impacts on biodiversity and nature. And this really culminated in the World Economic, the COP15, and actually also COP26, the big climate COP last year in Glasgow, and then and the ones before, but where nature was recognized as being a really key part of this. But when we look at what happened, having been delayed for a couple of years and ended up moving from China into Montreal, the global community rallied around the convention of the party on the Convention of Biological Diversity, COP15, and came up with an agreement around a global biodiversity framework. And this was adopted with incredible support and a huge amount of consensus that we needed to set our trajectory onto nature positive. So that was really unprecedented. We had a huge presence from the finance sector. Over 1,000 companies were there, loads of different financial institutions, all calling for particular targets and to rally around the contributions each of these different parts of the economy could make into generating a nature positive economy. And that's quite an extraordinary thing, because there were two particular targets that came through. There's 4 global goals, but within that various targets, and target 14 and 15 highlighted the key role that the finance sector and the corporate kind of commercial private sector play in the economy, and that they need to play in delivering successful outcomes for nature recovery. So there are 188 nations got together and they agreed this landmark biodiversity framework. And that's sort of based on, protecting and restoring 30% of land, freshwater and saltwater habitats by 2030, which are, probably you've seen this 30 by 30 targets, essentially 30% of land and water by 2030. So a huge amount of consensus, but it was also the first time that the private sector and finance sector had been part of nature conservation conversations, and loads of companies and countries were combined with the combined revenues of $1.5 trillion were urging the world leaders to adopt these different targets, and that is quite unprecedented. So if we look at this whole concept of nature positive and bending the curve through application and mitigation hierarchy, as I mentioned earlier, but really to try and look at changing business as usual, which was setting us on a grey trajectory to biodiversity loss and collapse of our ecosystems, loss of ecosystem services, loss of natural capital, to where we're doing business as usual right now is just not enough, and that every part of our economy has to actually contribute to the restoration and protection of wildlife and biodiversity and natural systems of all sorts of shapes and sizes and colors and from all over, in every sort of location, geography in the world, to try and get to recovery by 2050. So it's a huge challenge and a huge task that we've taken on. But these targets, the key takeaways really are that, we at that meeting, we got agreement that nature positive as a concept would be agreed and that we need to be part of it, that the finance sector and the private sector are also going to contribute to it, and that each government needs to start to put into place the regulations that will enable this and provide the kind of frameworks that will allow different kind of financing mechanisms or different kind of behaviors and practices to be part of the delivery of this, but essentially that we all need in some way or another to become part of mandatory systems that has been really absent in the past. A lot of voluntary sort of commitments in the past, the sort of NPI type commitments that we've seen, and sort of no net loss commitments that companies have made, but now it's becoming mainstreamed. So reporting on nature and your impacts is really important, and understanding how to measure this is important too. So we have to think at the back of that there's some complexity, but there are also systems and frameworks that we need to understand and be part of so that we can kind of get onto this journey. And there is an absolute alphabet soup of initiatives underway. I know that many of you as companies are a little bit overwhelmed by the reporting initiatives out there. There's sort of GRI, there's IFRC, there's kind of FRAG, there are all of these things, CDP. But each of these is essentially now becoming aligned, and they're all sort of asking for the same sort of thing. And really what we're trying to do, in fact, we've seen a huge alignment within the climate reporting sector now, and we will see the same coming in under nature and biodiversity. And much of this sits within the TNFD. And, you know, Sasha, here I've sort of whirlwinded us through to where we get to this alphabet soup, but the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is a hugely important framework. It's been driven by the finance sector, and it's asking companies to essentially understand the impacts and dependencies they have on nature, and to report on that in a very transparent way. And I wondered if you could just add here a little bit about the framework and you know, how you see it from the finance sector.
Sure, Pippa, thank you. So essentially the TNFD, or the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, is using the same framework, the same approach at a macro level as the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But one of the key differences is the speed at which this has been developed. So what took 10 years to develop the TCFD and get it to the point of implementation, the TNFD has created a framework that's fit for nature in 2 years. So the time has accelerated in terms of how this gets applied. We now have this TNFD. The logic of it and what's on the page here is this LEAP framework, which stands for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, those 4 boxes on the bottom. And as Pippa mentioned, what this really does is it for businesses that are interested, it's voluntary at the moment, but it won't be for long, as Pippa mentioned. And I'll get into that as well in a little bit. But the idea is to start off with your own business and look at where are the key nature-related dependencies and impacts. The first column there around locate, that interface with nature. What's the link? Where are the spaces? This can be site specific, but in the financial sector, it'll tend to be sector based. So what are the sectors of the economy that tend to have the biggest impacts and dependencies on nature? And then you would then go to locations, geographies, and regions. And so there's that lens that could be brought to it. And then the next step, once you identify really where the hotspots are, where you want to focus, it's where are those impacts, where are those dependencies. The third step is then what are the risks and the opportunities. And I'm glad as the drafting of the TNFD and the LEAP framework has evolved with different feedback, we've managed to get the opportunity lens in there. It's not just a risk-based framework. And so it's good that that's now been captured in the framework. And then the responsibility on the business, if you're using this framework, is then to report, to explain what those impacts and dependencies are and what you're doing about them. I see this as a baseline, right? So it's you do it to know really where are you placed, where are the risks, where are the dependencies, where are the impacts, and what's your ability to contribute to reducing those and moving to a nature positive space. It's really hard to be able to work on strategy and to think about your next steps until you really understand where you're currently at. So I think this is a great framework as a starting point. There's clearly a need in terms of how do you collect the data, and there's screening tools, and I'm sure Pippa will talk us through that more. But I just before handing back to Pippa, just to be able to situate how I see that this will move into the financial sector and then into regulation. So just recently, and this was on the previous slide in that alphabet soup of different initiatives, but the ISSB, or the International Sustainability Standards Board of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, the IFRS, just released its final standards for sustainability and climate related disclosures. And it was agreed that the ISB would take the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, and kind of swallow it, essentially. So there will no longer really be a TCFD. It'll become a part of the ISSB. And it will keep the same logic of the TCFD framework. And the thinking is that the same will eventually happen to the TNFD. So eventually the pathway would be that it would likely be kind of put into place in the ISSB. That's really, really important because the ISSB is positioning itself as the framework for standards for both climate and sustainability disclosures. And governments all over the world are taking that and then turning that into requirements. And so that would likely be the pathway for a nature-related standard to be taken through from a voluntary put into the ISB and then adopted by governments as a regulatory requirement. The ISSB is currently out for consultation on the new areas that it should be focusing on and working on. And there's 4 different areas that it's suggesting it could work on next: human capital, human rights, biodiversity and nature, and integrated reporting. And it will take probably 2 or 3 of those forward in its next work program, I would bet, given the placement of where the TNFD has gone and the movement around nature, that they would be looking really closely as that of one of them to come into this process. So I think it is inevitable that nature will be something that will be required by all companies pretty much all over the world in terms of being able to understand, work towards kind of solutions and requirements for disclosure. So that's only a matter of time. And the opportunity for businesses that are really thinking about these issues is that there's a window for leadership and for being able to get on the front foot and participate actively, be a first mover, and be able to then shape how nature becomes embedded in regulatory requirements in the future. And I think ASI has a really important role to play in shaping kind of what will come in the future. I'll hand back to Pippa.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sasha. Completely agree with you. You know, it's a rapidly moving space. And what's interesting is that there is we've got the science-based targets network, which is a really important part of this. There's been, they've been involved in trying to create a dialogue and kind of set standards and targets for climate as well. And there's a huge movement you can see by a number of papers and guidance documents that have been put forward to kind of help, I guess, couple not only what's going on in the TNFD, but as you say, also coming through in Europe with the CSRD, which is the corporate reporting for they're the whole standard around there, and that's a broad suite of ESG factors, but a huge amount that is very much aligned with what the TNFD is calling for. So regulations happening fast and furiously. The interesting part as well is that there are many countries which have subscribed now as a sort of what's come out of the Equator Principles, what's come out of this whole idea of net positive laws around when you're doing environmental impact assessments to deliver positive outcomes. EIAs did not always have an objective towards which it was more about mitigating impact and reducing risk. And now it's actually about what's good for nature and what's good for biodiversity. And actually those targets are being set by the likes of the Science-Based Targets for Nature initiative. So a lot of guidance sits within the TNFD for sectors and likewise for the SBTN to help try to get this. And it really is about setting targets for nature, and there is a roadmap to do that, and these all need to complement each other and are part of a very collaborative kind of ecosystem of its own that is sort of trying to make sure that we're all kind of talking to the same language, that where the terminology is the same, that what it means, what nature positive in one place means the same somewhere else. And so the organizations like the IUCN, which is a sort of community governments, non-governmental organizations have come around to as well, and they've just got a white paper on nature positive too. But there's an important part which goes back to what Fiona said at the beginning, is that actually nature is embedded in what's come through in all the kind of reports that we talk to, the part that nature plays in climate, in managing our kind of supply chains, in how we manage our relationship with local communities as well, Indigenous peoples, and that this is really part of an important, not just a narrative, but it's important to know that when we start to think about how to deliver on a nature positive strategy, for example, for a company, or are trying to contribute to a biodiversity strategy that has a kind of consequences beyond into our whole ESG portfolio, that we need to start to think about the touch points across all of these bits, how we manage our water, how we manage our climate strategies, how we manage our human kind of social management programs. Everything is linked, and we can't separate them as we used to. We can't operate in silos. We can't functionally deliver any of these aspects to any good effect unless we take a much more integrated approach. So when Sasha talks about integrated reporting, this is not just about trying to make the links physically, kind of in theory. It's actually delivering this stuff in a very, in complex contexts that we find ourselves operating in a much more cohesive and aware way. And to be fair, if I've looked at how SDG is reported on in many kind of corporate sustainability reports, it's all about, we can tick this box and we can tick that box and that box, very often 3 or 4, but it's actually not about how you can tick your box, it's how you can deliver on those. It's about delivering the impacts and the actions that are going to substantially shift us and bend that curve. So back to kind of how SBTN fits into these different frameworks. I'm not going to repeat what Sasha said, but I'm just going to talk very briefly about nature positive as a framework. And I know we've only got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to be very quick. Nature positive for a company, if you just think about, your role, it's really quite simple, and we have to make it very pragmatic. And if you break it down into these 5 parts, it actually becomes quite manageable. The first is understanding the relationship, and that's what TNFD is trying to do. It's what are your impacts and dependencies? How does how are your activities and operations touching on, impacting, or maybe dependent on nature? That's important. Then you need to understand just what it is in your own company around your commitments. Do you have good board level buy-in? Do you have a strategy? Do you have policies and practices? Is it integrated with your other policies and practices, like your water or your climate practices? And then it comes down to kind of the practical side of it. So those are sort of like what's going on in theory. Then it's about what you're doing at operational level. Can you deliver a positive impact where your direct footprints are? Can you start to prioritize nature-based solutions? And that may be in your social management programs, water management, how you deal with carbon and climate balances in your offsets, etc. And then how you engage in the transformation of your value chain. So what is it that you're buying, and where are you selling your stuff into? Are you part of the value chain? Now, ASI has a really strong touch points here because of our value chain of custody approach. We can track and trace that, and it makes it so much easier when we start to think about these influences. So if you are buying stuff from a company or from a mine that is doing things really responsibly, it makes your life a lot easier, and you can actually be on that nature positive trajectory. But importantly, and just quickly on this, you need to understand what it is that you're doing. So your relationship with nature and the application of the mitigation hierarchy, you can't declare that you are nature positive unless you've done some of the number crunching. And it doesn't have to be, too complicated, but you cannot make any claims unless you've understood what you're doing and that relationship. So there are a couple of basic principles here around understanding the state of nature. So you could measure that using the kind of core principles of what comprises an ecosystem, the composition of biodiversity, the structure of the ecosystem and the function, because that is your natural capital. But then you've got to understand your risks. So that's where you can, and your impacts, you've got to be able to measure those. And then declare essentially how you're responding, and you can have indicators and metrics that apply to that. So, you know, start thinking about this in terms of the evidence that you can start to put into the systems. And TNFD asks for that. They want you to understand location. They want you to understand your biodiversity and you know, what you've got there, how valuable it is, protected areas, species that are there, but also what your footprint is on this all. So, you know, that is just something we need to be need to make sure is part of the way that we're delivering. There's a very interesting framework, which I'm going to zip over because I don't think we've got time for, but really it is about understanding that we have a kind of a huge potential to contribute to nature positive, and that we've got to all get onto this journey, and wherever we start, you know, we've got to start soon. Yesterday would be best. Fiona, I'm conscious of time, and I want to make sure that there's time for questions. So I'm going to shoot through. There's just a couple which was talking about the definition of biodiversity and ecosystem services, but I'm going to land on the finishing slide here. And thanks, Sasha. We're happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Pippa. That was amazing. A huge amount of detail in there, and we've already had a request for maybe being able to share your slides. If you're up with that, we can certainly share those with certainly the participants that are here. One of the questions that I had, and I know this is taking us back into some of the meat of the slides, but in there, you had a slide around breaching planetary boundaries that I remember you speaking to before, and I'm finding myself very struck by, because we are often very focused, particularly in this value chain, on the climate piece, the urgency, the feeling of thresholds, but that in fact, if I recall correctly, you know, the biodiversity piece has already exceeded those. I wonder if you want to just go back to that and just touch on that a little bit, because it helps to, I think, recalibrate what we feel as this sense of urgency, you know, around many issues. And we're really trying to emphasize, as you've brought out really nicely, that interconnected piece. But I think to kind of, talk a little bit about this would be really useful.
Yeah, and it's an extraordinary sort of eye-watering kind of image, actually, because, you know, climate sits here in the sort of breached its orange, and we're desperately, and I suspect it's gone beyond that right now, to be honest, given all the kind of evidence that we see is coming through from science but yes, we've got critical elements. So biogeochemical flows essentially is the pollutants that we're putting into our rivers and into the ocean and into the soils. And these we've way beyond the planetary boundary limits, the biosphere integrity, the loss of biodiversity, the ability for us to maintain that natural capital that provides, you know, the services that we get from nature. So if you think about biodiversity or ecosystems as the stock of natural capital, we have essentially depleted that beyond what is sustainable. So the reason we want to try and recover things by stop decline by 2030 and recover by 2050 is because that natural capital from which we get all these services are, you know, flood defense, food, water, you know, everything, the productivity of our soils is all dependent on good biodiversity and healthy biodiversity. So we've breached all of these, and we've just got to make sure that we kind of live within the limits that we know have you know, we can sustain our sort of not only our economies but actually life on Earth. Actually, to be fair, yes, I don't know if that did the job. Yeah.
No, perfect. Thank you. So we have a question around how, and we find this in ASI as well, that organizations, ASI members, they're always looking for, you know, how exactly do I get started? What's the recipe for me? I'm this kind of company. I'm a remelter, or I'm a smelter, or I'm a downstream manufacturer. I'm in the finance sector. I'm a bank. What kind of sort of more tailored guidance is out there? You know, are there specific kind of, I've never thought about this before, where would I start?
Yeah, really good question. I think Sasha's sort of, you know, and I think that little framework, so if I go back to that sort of framework which is really about nature positive is this one. Honestly, there are simple questions you've got to start asking of yourself and your company, and just where your company sits within a value chain. So what is my relationship with nature? You know, do I have a basic strategy? Can I ask my company to make a commitment? So the first thing is you've got to have a commitment to nature positive, or to something that's going to be better than where you're at today, and then start to put in place some of the infrastructure, you could call it, the kind of corporate infrastructure, which is having a policy, having a kind of a strategy that speaks to that, have a plan about how you can start to shift things. And when you start to understand your relationship with nature, you can start to kind of break it down into manageable chunks, because it's not, you need to be able to prioritize. And actually, Sasha, you mentioned sort of global screening tools. You know, some of us, you know, our companies are working in one location. Some are kind of quite diversified and like quite, you know, have multiple operations in multiple countries. And some of those will be in very sensitive landscapes. Some may not be, but you need to be able to start somewhere. So you could prioritize where your biodiversity vulnerabilities might be, where you may have higher level of risk. And you know, if you're in an area where people are particularly dependent on nature for their livelihoods, then you really need to start to understand if you're impacting that. And if you know, because if you have a codependency on water, for example, your local community and you as a company both need water, this can create conflict and competition. And that is a nature-related risk. You can start having operational complexities and start, you know, finding that your social license to operate, your presence in that landscape is difficult because you have nature-related risks emerging. So things can be kind of broken down into kind of bite-sized chunks, Fiona, so that you know, and a lot of industries, a lot of sectors have got very good guidance actually. So what comes through from the International Council for Mining and Metals, for example, they've got some guidance on how, you know, you need to do that. Our own principles and standards, actually, if you comply with those and start to put in, make sure that those are meaningfully applied, then you should be on the way. And it's all about the mitigation hierarchy, avoiding impacts and minimizing and making sure that you're contributing to a positive outcome.
Maybe just to add to that, I mean that the TCFD and now the TNFD have been largely initially targeting the financial sector, because I guess the theory is that if you can get this embedded in the financial sector, it then has to then push out to all other sectors that the financial sector engages with, lends to, invests in. And so that's kind of where that's starting. But there are a number of businesses all over the world that have piloted the TNFD. And as those pilots start to go through the final process that get published, there becomes a body of knowledge of this business in this sector in this region has done X. And it's a really useful source of information to be able to look at kind of businesses sort of like me in terms of what they have done. And it doesn't mean you have to copy it because the frameworks are, I wouldn't say they're choose your own adventure anymore. There's a bit more structure and guidance to it, but it's still not, there is work to interpret and learn. And over years, it'll become more prescriptive and clear. At the moment, it's still, here's some questions, here's a framework, go through these steps, think this through, and keep going type thing. And so it will get, I imagine there will be more specific industry guidance that will be developed over time. But at the moment, there are examples and they will become more numerous as companies work through and start publishing that. And those are things for us to keep our eyes on in terms of what comes out.
I saw one for a nature positive for the tourist sector the other day. I mean, it's, you know, everybody's trying to contribute in whatever way they can be. So, you know, I think there is a lot more becoming available in general terms too.
And the intent, people who are actually trying to drive this, like and coordinate across, like governments or associations of multiple stakeholders, they're looking for different sectors and different regions because you want that cross section and that mix. And so that's kind of what's being looked for in terms of anybody interested in doing a pilot. We're looking for this diversity.
And actually, just I think many countries under the Convention on Biological Diversity, there is a requirement for nation states to actually set up business and nature forums. So the UK Business and Biodiversity or Business and Nature Forum is actually starting to support companies in how they deliver on net nature positive. But I know there's one in Australia, there's certainly one in South Africa, and I think there's very strong one in Europe too. So you know, that they're kind of quite useful references where people are sort of sharing practices and like a community of practice.
Excellent. So we've had a couple more questions coming in. One is around, I guess, following on from this, what about those companies that are operating in industrial or economic zones that mightn't immediately think, you know, that they have that sort of nature location exposure? I know you talked a little bit about thinking about sourcing and materials and things like that. And certainly within the ASI standards, we had people think, well, this doesn't really apply to me, but some creative thinking actually identified some places that it really does, even in an industrial context. Is there anything that you wanted to speak to on that in your experience, Pippa or Sasha?
I think it's important to think of your whole ecosystem, your value chain. And so, you know, it may be that you're located in an industrial area which has, you know, a permit to do the kind of activities that it's been permitted for. But when you look at your footprint, so part of the TNFD that is identifying your footprint, and your footprint may be in another country entirely. It may be in another in another industry sector as well. So, you know, you may have to look back all the way to the mine where the bauxite comes from, or into your markets where you may be selling into an industry to build something that may also have a footprint. So that awareness is there. But nature positive as a kind of concept is part of it, is almost a philosophy too. So is there something you can contribute to I guess the state of nature, improving, protecting, restoring nature in your landscape beyond the kind of walls of or the gates or the fences of your industrial zone into that landscape? Can you go into what your contribute to national objectives, and then, you know, into international global biodiversity goals? So there's a sort of hierarchy or a tier of contribution that you can make that should relate in some way to your footprint, because, you know, otherwise we're just, you know, contributing ad hoc. So trying to make that relationship is really important. So that's why the locate component is so relevant. But you know, once all of that has been done, then, you know, there are additional conservation actions which are really important, and a lot of companies are making 3 tiers of commitment actually. One, to absolve their direct impacts, some around the secondary, tertiary kind of indirect impacts through their value chains and footprint, and then some into what the global biodiversity goal is calling for.
Just to add a little bit to that, I mean, you can make another analogy to climate in terms of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Like you think about everything. And so if you're not directly kind of at a site specific kind of level having direct impacts, you're going to have them either in your supply chain or in your customers. I mean, an industrial process would be dependent on key resources coming from nature. And so that would be a starting point. And it's just asking the questions, where are the links, and where are the places, and what regions, what industries, what sectors will have those hotspots or those things to consider.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question. So there's one here asking about when you have a net positive impact for direct operations, that might lock you into a very specific kind of accounting framework or specific actions that really focuses on the site-based side of things. If we start to think about broader landscapes and those kind of national, subnational sort of goals and other drivers of nature loss, whether that's an upstream operation, a mine, or a mineral processing site where those kinds of activities are operating, are there alternative opportunities, do you think, for greater nature positive returns that's not just about the site and achieving, you know, net positive more broadly beyond that? So can you go beyond no net loss for site-based impacts and to think more broadly. What's your thoughts on that? Is that starting to get exciting?
Yeah, so I don't know, Sasha, shall I jump in first? Is that okay? Because this one really excites me too, because I absolutely, I like to think in landscapes. I like to look at, and ecosystems don't have boundaries, they don't have walls, you know.
Right.
They may have, you know, if there's a sort of a river system or something, or but yes, very much looking into how one can contribute to the overall ecosystem. So the restoration of landscapes, the increase of connectivity between one patch of landscape or habitat and another, you know, increasing the quality of corridors that species can move through. And actually, you know, there is such a demand, such a need for restoration and ecologically sound restoration that you know, contributing into and working with other sectors and other operators and other land users in those landscapes is really critical, because, you know, what our neighbours do can often erode, you know, what we're trying to do on our own site, and actually trying to create a kind of common objective. And there are a couple of concepts around you know, the conservation hierarchy or landscape level conservation objectives, really, that have to go in with multiple users, multiple stakeholders. So you're looking at cross-sectoral, stakeholder initiatives, which can make it complicated, but it actually can make it actually far more successful in the sustainability of the outcomes that you know, that we can achieve by doing that. So yes, you know, local, but sometimes actually far more can be achieved by working in a broader sense in a landscape.
I would just echo what Pippa said, but also I think that's where the fun begins, right? Like it's you need to be able to understand your impacts and dependencies, where were the risks, and manage them. Like, don't put your head in the sand and just play in the fun places. So you need to be able to deal with what you have and reduce the negative to move towards positive, but you shouldn't stop there, because there could be other things that you can do that become really valuable and a key part of the value proposition of the organization. Like, I work for a bank, and we're, I think, the only bank in the world that owns a conservation reserve, right? And you'd initially think, why? What does that, like, how does that work? But we're actually using it as a learning by doing site, understanding methods, methodologies, thinking about emerging markets and how do biodiversity markets play with carbon markets. And so actually we're learning a lot that we can then apply to products and services, insights, engagement with customers. And so there are those different kinds of linkages that you can think through if you are able to take a bit of a broader perspective.
I think that's absolutely one. So just an additional point to that is, you know, I'm working with the services sector, so the finance sector is part of that. But actually, you know, when you get a bank, kind of a legal firm or a land management firm coming in and saying, like, we actually don't own land, we don't have a physical footprint, but actually all our activities are related to what other people are doing, and the advice that we may be giving to them on what they could or should or can or cannot do in those lands. And it makes for a huge amount of creativity. But it does make you think about this whole concept, which for me underpins the TNFD, and that's around economic transformation. So that what we invest in, the kind of activities what we're contributing to, and we're participating in, are nature positive, that they're actually good for the environment, not having a negative impact. And if we start to think of it in that way, we find a huge amount of potential in economic instruments about, you know, how we kind of regenerative agriculture, the whole sort of you know, what it catalyzes so many different possibilities, and it also makes us think about the land that we may have influence or management control over, and are there ways that we can kind of do things differently that are contributing to a positive nature outcome, but also, you know, positive in terms of what we can do to climate mitigate and build resilience in the whole natural system.
I know, such a massive topic. Thank you to both of you for really thoughtful and wide-ranging reflections on that. We didn't even have the opportunity to talk about the role of Indigenous peoples, you know, within kind of nature frameworks, which is a really big part of some of those international frameworks too. Huge. And certainly it's something that we're keeping an eye on in ASI and thinking towards our next revision of the standards out towards 2027. How do we kind of as well do our own alignment work and see some of these sort of frameworks coming through and structure the ASI standards to make that efficient for everybody. Thank you for the questions that have come through and for your attentive participation this evening. We'll make the recording available, and thank you for sharing the slides as well, Pippa. We'll send those through to those who registered. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everybody. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.